listeners, I'm Hallie.
And I'm Brittany.
And thank you for tuning back into The Abyss. Don't forget to subscribe and to give us a like, a rating, follow us on The Abyss Pod. We love to hear from you guys and we love your support. So please reach out, make sure you tune in on every new episode, and keep updated. Also, don't forget that at the end of every episode, we like to have a little blooper section kind of making fun of our mistakes during recording process because we're human and we mess up. So don't forget to check that out. It's always lightens the mood a little bit.
Today we're bringing you the story of a couple of newlyweds that go on their honeymoon thinking everything is great and they're going to start their lives together, but one of them doesn't make it home. What seemed like an accident turns out to possibly be a lot more.
Let's jump into it. So the woman we're focusing on today is Christina Watson. She was born on February 13th in 1977 in Ramstein, Germany. She moved to the U.S. while she was a baby because she was adopted in 1980 by William and Cindy Thomas, and William goes by Tommy. We'll refer to him a lot in this episode. They lived in Walker County, Alabama, and then they lived in Louisiana before they ended up moving to Birmingham, Alabama, where they currently resided. Christina didn't have it so easy. She was diagnosed with paroxysmal supraventricular tachycardia, which is also known as PSVT. Some background on PSVT: the people who experience it sometimes have no symptoms, but they can also have palpitations, lightheadedness, sweating, shortness of breath, chest pain, and the episodes are pretty sudden. The cause of these episodes are unknown, but it can also be due to alcohol, caffeine, nicotine, or just stress or pre-existing syndromes.
While studying at the University of Alabama, Christina met Gabe Watson, and she was actually dating someone else at the time. And when she broke up with that man, Gabe was there. You know, they got really close. And after a while, they started dating. One thing Gabe really liked to do was scuba dive. He had been scuba diving since the late 90s. He had his open water certification, his advanced open water, and he also had his nitrox and rescue diver certifications. So he really liked to dive, and that was a big part of his life.
And it's pretty costly to go get a bunch of certifications.
Yeah,
so he was really devoted to it, to spend a mass amount of money into getting these different.
Yeah, and he actually became friends with the man that owned the dive shop where he got certified, so they would go on trips sometimes. And Tina and Gabe got married on October 11th, 2003. Tina's father kind of had a bad feeling about this. He didn't really think that Gabe was going to take care of her or treat her the way she deserved to be treated, which I think that can be a common thing that
a concern of many fathers.
Yeah. When Tommy, Christina's father, asked Gabe if he loved Tina, Gabe said he thought that saying that was kind of corny, but that it just felt right with Tina, but he wouldn't actually, say the L word, so.
Kind of off-putting a little bit.
Definitely for a father. The wedding went on, and the couple planned their honeymoon to be a scuba diving trip in Australia. They wanted to see the Great Barrier Reef. They wanted to see a sea turtle migration, and they had big dreams for it. Tina was not an avid diver, but she really wanted to participate in the things that Gabe liked to do. So right before their wedding, she went and got her dive certification and started diving a little bit. By the time of their honeymoon, she had about 11 dives logged, but some of those were unsuccessful dives. I don't think they should really be counted. From her dive log, you can see she had about 5 successful dives, and the rest had been aborted after 3 to 5 minutes or so.
This was because Tina was a very stressed diver, is what was stated, that she would start to kind of get panicky underwater and would have to abort during training sessions.
Yeah, the dive instructor even said that she was a really ill-prepared diver, and he had some concerns about that. So not the greatest start to a scuba diving honeymoon, but she was a trooper and went on with it. Gabe, on the other hand, had 53 log dives by the time of their honeymoon. But while that seems like a lot, if you actually look at his dive logs, a lot of his dives were pretty short and pretty shallow. A lot of them were in either like swimming pools or in small sections of a quarry. 50 of those 53 dives were less than 20 minutes. 31 of those 53 dives were less than 30 feet.
Yeah, so when you think about the depth and the time he spent underwater, those are kind of like what you do when you're training. So it seems like maybe he should have gone longer, maybe deeper distances before planning a trip to the Great Barrier Reef or something like that out in the ocean. And considering that both you and I have scuba certifications already, even though we both only have our open water, we kind of know the basics of what it takes to get your scuba certification, and those really seem like training dives.
Yeah.
He did have 15 ocean dives, but they were usually on his trip with his friend who worked at a dive shop, and they weren't really deep or long. Like we mentioned before, he only had a few that were actually deeper than 30 feet and longer than 20 minutes.
Right. So even though it seems like a lot of experience, maybe not so much. So when you start scuba diving, you of course have to fill out a lot of waivers, a lot of paperwork about your health, because they want to make sure you're in good shape to do it. It puts a lot of stress on your body in a weird way. So Tina had to fill out the forms, and unfortunately she decided not to disclose that she had had PSVT or that she had had heart surgery previously. She lied about that on her paperwork. That concerned her father too. He had known that she had had this issue, and a lot of her family was kind of against the scuba diving. A lot of them were pretty surprised because she wasn't really the kind of person that they thought would be scuba diving or, you know, be in that situation. So it surprised a lot of people and concerned a lot of people, but she wanted to do it because her husband loved it.
Another thing that really bothered Tina's father was that Gabe had said if he had to do the things that Tina wanted to do, then she had to do the things that he liked to do, and that was scuba diving, which sounds a little bit controlling, and it was probably more of a concern from the father, thinking like he's going to make her do something that could possibly be unsafe for her.
Yeah, and he actually made that statement while he was meeting to ask for Tina's hand in marriage, so that's kind of scary for a father to hear from the man that wants to marry his daughter.
But they still married, they still planned this honeymoon, and they decided to go to dive the wreck of the SS Yongala in Australia. Once they had gotten there, on October 22nd, 2003, the two set off on the Spoil Sport boat with Mike Ball Expeditions to go out to the SS Yongala. Wade Singleton was a dive master on the boat, and he told Tina that she might have needed to practice her skills a little bit more, but she refused by saying, you know, she felt like she could do it. She felt confident. She wasn't nervous about it.
So they each had their own equipment that they had bought previously. They just used the company's air tanks and weights. We know a lot of you might not be super familiar with scuba diving, so on our website in the show notes for this episode, we have a picture that sort of lays out all the dive equipment that we're going to be talking about, so definitely make sure you refer to that if you don't really know much about scuba diving.
Yeah, if you get confused, go on there and pull it up, and it'll have labels for everything that's on a person when they go diving, all of their dive equipment. So if we're referring to BCDs or regulators and things like that, you can go and check that out and know exactly what we're talking about and where that would have been on an individual's body at the time of the incident.
Gabe and Tina felt confident enough that they not only refused to participate in the orientation dives, but they also refused to dive alongside the dive master.
Which was a really big shock considering that Tina didn't really know as much about diving out in the ocean.
Yeah, she had never been in the ocean. She didn't have that many dives, but I think she either felt that Gabe was qualified enough or that it wouldn't be too hard, and they decided to go. But they did attend the briefings that sort of went about the overview of the dives, what was expected on the ship, where to put your equipment, and basic things like that.
So once the morning protocols were over, they went ahead and got in the water, and a few minutes after being in, Gabe and Tina returned back to the Spoil Sport. There was an issue with Gabe's dive computer. A dive computer is something that scuba divers will wear that tells them the depth, the water temperature, the time, things that they need to keep track of themselves in the water. And he was saying that his was beeping at him and that it was malfunctioning. So they returned to the surface and they realized that the battery was in backwards. So he went ahead and fixed it before they returned to the water. They also knew that Tina was having some trouble getting down in the water column because she was underweighted. So when you go in the water as a diver, you have to have a proper weight distribution. So that way you become neutrally buoyant in the water and you float easier. It's easier to swim. It's easier to turn around, change directions, all kinds of things.
Yeah, you're not constantly rocking into the surface or sinking to the bottom.
She had been underweighted, so they went ahead and added some weights to her. And this is normal for an amateur diver. It's hard to figure out your weights.
Yeah, we both have had issues.
Yeah, it's very difficult. And so Uzi Barney, a diving videographer and a dive master, as well as a dive instructor, assisted them with their issues and then sent them back to the water.
After they got all those issues resolved, they went back into the water. But about 2 minutes later, Gabe claimed that the currents were really, really strong. Tina started panicking a little bit and started signaling that she wanted to go back to the rope that would take them back to the boat. They were about 45 feet deep at this point. Gabe said Tina looked really worried, that he looked at her, she looked back at him, and he could tell that she was getting pretty scared. She became fatigued pretty quickly, so Gabe began towing her and tried to pull her back to the ascent line. But at this point, she really started panicking and she started grabbing at him. She pulled his mask off, she pulled his regulator out, and he let go of her so he could fix that.
And for anyone who doesn't know, a regulator is what gives you oxygen supply when you're underwater from your tank. So his oxygen source was knocked off and his mask to be able to see while he's underwater was knocked off.
By the time he got all that situated, cleared his mask, got his other regulator in, he said that Tina was just too far away, he couldn't reach her, and that she was sinking to the bottom. He said she was about 10 feet below him with her arms raised, just sinking.
And she was sinking so quickly to the bottom of the ocean floor, which was 98 feet under the surface. So they were about halfway to the full depth that she would sink to the bottom of the floor.
Gabe said he then had to make a quick decision. He didn't know, should he go and try to get her or should he go for help? And he decided to leave her there and go for help. And he said he started ascending pretty rapidly, as fast as he could go, to go find somebody to help him.
One of the reasons he decided not to go deeper to go grab her was he was having some pains in his ear from mild barotrauma, which is when the ear pressure in your ears isn't equalized properly and causes some damage.
Another diver in the area, Gary Stempler, was taking pictures of his wife under the water. But later, when he was going through his pictures, he realized that one of them actually depicted Tina on the ocean floor. In the picture, which we have on our website, so go check that out if you want to see it.
It's a very haunting photo.
It is very, very haunting. You can see her lying face up on the ocean floor. No bubbles coming up or anything like that.
You can also see Wade Singleton, which was the dive master, in the water with them, swimming towards her in the photo to help.
Wade Singleton was diving and he saw Tina on the ocean floor there. He thought maybe at first that she was looking up at some fish or something like that, so he started looking around trying to see what she was seeing. But then he realized that there were no bubbles coming up from her exhaling. There were no movements. She was just still on the bottom.
And he couldn't see any dive buddy around her, so he knew something must be wrong. She's alone.
Yeah, and that's one thing, if you don't know much about diving, one of the most important parts of it is never dive alone.
Always have a buddy.
So he went over to her and retrieved her and started making an emergency ascent. At this point, Tina still had a regulator in her mouth. So Wade surfaced with her, signaled for help, and instead of taking her to the spoil sport, they took her to the closest boat, which was the Jazz 2. And once Tina was up on the boat, they removed her equipment and started doing CPR and chest compressions and all of that to try to revive her.
Tina Watson was under the water for a total of 10 minutes. And when they finally got her up on the boat, they were asking if there was doctors around, but the doctors were on the spoil sport. So Uzi Barney performed mouth-to-mouth while Wade did compressions for 5 minutes until the doctors could get over. Dr. John Downey was there, and he tried to resuscitate her for a total of 40 minutes. There was also another doctor present, Dr. Stanley Stutz, and he was also helping in any way he could as well. Clearly, this was an emergency situation. The doctor was requesting medical supplies from Spoil Sport. The doctor administered 3 doses of epinephrine medication while oxygen was provided to Tina. Another person was taking notes, and everyone except the doctors were rotating places, trading off on who was doing compressions and who was taking the notes and who was helping provide oxygen. It was notified to them that the helicopter would be an hour away, and they realized they couldn't find a pulse on Tina. They tried her carotid artery and they tried her wrist, and they just could not find a pulse. It was agreed by Dr. Stanley Stutz and Dr. John Downey that at this point Tina could be considered deceased, but they still continued compressions for a few more minutes, and then they announced that she was dead at 11:21 a.m. Wade Singleton checked her air tank, the valve, and her jacket. Her jacket was unharmed. Her valve was opened, which means that airflow was coming from her tank into a regulator, and she had 2,000 psi in the tank, which means she had plenty of air.
During all of this going on, Gabe had come up. He was looking for help. But after he learned that Tina was on the Jazz 2 and that she was receiving CPR, he never made an attempt to go over. He just sort of stayed on the spoil sport. Even though there were dinghies going back and forth with equipment and supplies, he just decided to stay on the spoil sport while they were trying to resuscitate Tina.
After she was declared dead, Gabe finally asked Wade Singleton if he could go over to the Jazz 2 and see Tina. And he allowed him. Obviously, you're not going to decline the husband from seeing his wife. And when they got over there, he was visibly upset and distraught that Tina was dead. He was crying, and it looked to be very hard on him. At 12:30 p.m., they finally departed from the wreck site and went back to the port of Townsville. On October 23rd, 2003, so this was the day after the incident, an autopsy was performed by Professor David Williams. He was a consultant forensic pathologist in Queensland, and he said that the cause of death is drowning, and there was evidence of an air embolism. But even though she had a heart condition, her heart was healthy. So nothing about her PSVT caused her to pass away. And initially, this was all considered an accident from panic and inexperience, because clearly Tina wasn't as experienced as some of the other divers that were out there, and she probably could have practiced a little bit more, like Wade Singleton said. And she did panic some when they were doing training sessions and when they were doing the dives outside of training.
Yeah, so she didn't have a good track record of being a calm diver, and it can be a scary experience. So definitely a lot of people can panic, and that's definitely something that can happen. Not everyone was so sure this was an accident, though. Two other divers present, Ken Snyder and his wife Paula, would raise some suspicions about Gabe a little bit later on. But initially, they tried to comfort him. They were horrified at what had happened, and they tried to be there and help Gabe however they could. Paula Snyder kind of took Gabe, and she was with him a lot of the time, trying to comfort him, trying to make sure that he was okay and that he was doing everything that, needs to happen after a horrible accident like that.
Yeah, Paula was comforting Gabe on the boat while everything was going on with trying to resuscitate Tina, and she was asking him what happened, what was wrong, and Gabe was saying that Tina was overweighted and he couldn't carry her up, and he told her to inflate her BCD, which is a vest that you wear that can inflate or deflate with air to help you either be more buoyant or sink faster. And he was telling her to inflate her BCD, but she didn't, and then she started sinking. And so all of that in the moment kind of made sense to Paula. He was trying to help her, she was panicking, and started sinking. Paula continued talking to Watson, trying to comfort him, make him feel better, and Paula Snyder made a statement saying that, quote, Watson said he was glad that they got to spend the first week in Sydney, and that the first week belonged to her and the second week belonged to him, end quote.
Which, in hindsight, is kind of a... Ooh.
I mean, your wife just died on this trip in Sydney. I mean, the last thing on my mind would be, she got the first week, I get the second,
Yeah. And that may have seemed a little bit weird, but she just thought, he's a little bit traumatized. It's just such a hard situation, so she kind of breezed past it. Paula really tried to get Gabe to call his parents. She was trying to convince him, you have to call your parents, you have to call Tina's parents, and let people know what happened. But Gabe really didn't want to do that. He told her that he didn't want to call his parents because they'd be asleep and he didn't want to wake them up. He said that he didn't want to call Tina's parents because he thought her dad would be out of town and he wanted everyone to be together when he told them. So he came up with a lot of excuses about not contacting the families.
Which seems a little out of the ordinary. I know if it was me on this trip, I would wake up everyone.
Yeah.
Round the roosters, because...
Really, I mean, it's not like you're just calling with some, mundane news. It's your wife just died.
Yeah. In a very traumatizing way.
Yeah, so I wouldn't even be thinking about what time it was, time zones and all that stuff. I would just be like, wake up.
Yeah. And finally, Paula convinced Gabe to call his parents, and while he was on the phone with them, he just kept mentioning this pain in his ears, and that's why he didn't go grab her. But Paula noted that it seemed like he was talking a lot more about his ears than he was about Tina. Instead of taking the responsibility for calling Tommy and Cindy, which are Tina's parents, he asked his father on the phone if he could call Tina's father. And then he continued to talk more about his ears, and finally they got off the phone. Once they were off the phone, Gabe's dad did call Tommy, and he told him about Tina. He handed the phone to a pastor and just let the pastor talk to him, which I think is kind of...
Yeah, it's...
distant. It's not very personal.
It's not. It's... Not only did Gabe put the responsibility off to his father, but his father kind of put it off to somebody else too.
And if I remember it correctly, wasn't it just kind of a, hey, Tina passed away on this honeymoon. Here's the pastor.
Yeah.
Like, it wasn't a long conversation.
No, it was just that one sentence. He said something like, I don't know how to tell you this, but Tina drowned. Here's a pastor.
Yeah. So very quick, very much not wanting to take the responsibility to tell someone.
Paula's husband, Ken, had been diving for 20 years. He was a dive master. He had over 500 successful dives.
He was very experienced.
Yeah, he really knew what he was talking about. And he mentioned that the way that Gabe described her thinking seemed too peaceful and still for someone who was panicking.
He has a good point.
Yeah, when you're drowning or panicked in that situation, almost everyone is going to be flailing, grabbing at anything they can, trying to climb out of the water. You're not just
trying to swim to the surface.
Yeah.
Usually you have to worry about people rushing to the surface and getting the bends because they're panicked, but instead she was just sinking peacefully.
Snyder actually called Gabe's statement bullshit and said that he didn't know what had happened, but it definitely didn't happen the way that Gabe described it. Snyder said that with her being only 10 feet below him, it would have taken about 2 kicks to get to her. So she wasn't that far from him. He could have easily grabbed her. Snyder said that whether you're a rescue diver or an amateur, this would have been an easy rescue.
So the Snyders had their suspicions, but so did Wade Singleton. And if you remember, he was the dive master who went and got Tina off of the ocean floor and brought her back up to the surface. And he said that when Gabe was explaining how Tina knocked off his mask and his regulator, that it sounded like she didn't succeed in knocking off his mask and regulator. Also, Gabe never mentioned to Singleton that he tried to grab her or that his ears hurt, which he had in other stories to other people. So it seems like maybe Gabe was leaving out information.
Gabe had given a lot of conflicting stories.
What's a better way to raise suspicion than changing your story?
Because the death was so sudden, the state coroner's office opened an investigation.
There were so many parts of his stories that were conflicting or didn't make sense or proved to be inaccurate that we actually have a little list that we kind of gathered. And so to start off, Gabe claimed that he was a rescue diver and he was not taught how to get someone that was in distress to the surface.
Which is kind of the definition of rescue when you're diving.
Yeah, what other thing are you doing when you're diving other than getting someone from under the water to the surface? So it seems very unlikely that he didn't learn that. And when investigators took a closer look at his certification, they saw that he was taught how to retrieve unconscious people and bring them back to the surface. So he was downplaying his qualifications. This was only the first inconsistent fact that they found.
So if you remember, the first dive that Gabe and Tina did had to be cut short because Gabe's computer was acting up. It was beeping at him, and he said he came out of the water, turned the batteries around, and everything was fine. But when investigators looked at his dive computer, they found that if the batteries are in backwards, the computer just doesn't work at all. It wouldn't be beeping, it wouldn't be doing anything, it just would not turn on.
Yeah, so how would he have heard beeping from his dive computer when it wouldn't have been working?
Amanda Phillips, who is Tina's best friend, mentioned that before the trip, she and Tina went to the dive shop to pick up this dive computer because it had been malfunctioning previously. And she said when they got to the dive shop, Tina took the computer back, and the man there said that the problem was that the batteries were backwards. When she told Gabe when they got home, they had a big laugh about it. Tina was like, you're this experienced diver and you don't even know how to put batteries in. So this had happened previously, and somehow between that and this dive, the batteries got turned around again.
And it was right before the trip when that happened, because he started loading up the equipment after
Yeah,
that.
she literally brought it home from the shop, gave it right to him, and he loaded it up.
Another thing that makes this dive computer situation a little off is when you go diving, you have to be very cautious of your dive computer. It tells you how to descent at a safe rate so you don't get decompression sickness, and it tells you how to manage your ascent rates as well. Also, they recommend not switching your dive computer when you're going between dives, because the amount of nitrogen in your system isn't going to be accurate. It's not going to be able to appropriately tell you how long you should wait or how deep you should go. So I think it was kind of weird that he had to flip it around. And
yeah, and technically, aren't you supposed to wait a full day before diving again if you have an issue with your dive computer?
Yeah, something like that. Another incident that didn't quite add up when you looked at the whole day's details was that Gabe's ears were hurting. But an expert said that the barotrauma, in his opinion, was very mild, and that it was received earlier than the day of the dive. So it wasn't from being in the water just then, it was something that he had gotten prior to the trip. And since it was mild, the expert said that he wouldn't need medication, he didn't need to seek professional help for it, and that it would heal on its own. So I think that's kind of interesting that it doesn't seem like a huge deal, although I've never had barotrauma, so maybe it hurts more than I think.
I think it also depends on your pain tolerance to some degree too. I've known people that have completely busted out eardrums and still dived, and so it's hard to say with that. Some people can experience a lot of pain and be fine. Some people are kind of less tolerant of it, but either way, the doctor said it was so mild that it really was not a severe case at all. Gabe also mentioned that while he was ascending to go get help for Tina, that he came across two divers and he tried to tell them what was going on. He was shaking them, he was trying to motion, but he wasn't using proper hand signals, so they couldn't really understand what he was saying. And when he realized that they wouldn't help him, that they couldn't understand, he just left them and went on. But investigators, they talked to every diver in that area, every crew member, every dive master, and no one reported being either of those two people that Gabe had come across. So they could not find those people. They couldn't talk to them.
Yeah, it's a weird inconsistency. Also, Gabe mentioned that he rocketed to the surface for help. He said that it was probably the fastest he had ever swam. However, when you look back at his dive computer, it said that he only ascended from 15 meters, and it took him between 2 to 3 minutes to reach the surface. This means that he was not rushing, because when you ascend, it should be 10 meters per minute.
And that's just a normal ascent. That's not a panic. That's not looking for help. That's just what you're supposed to do.
That's an average safety ascent, 10 meters per every minute. He was 15 meters, and he took 2 to 3 minutes to get up there. Also, he didn't inflate his BCD, and he didn't drop his weights. So he wasn't in a rush. He wasn't making an emergency ascent. And I think that if I was in that situation, I would be like, forget the nitrogen. I don't care. Get me to the surface. I need help. When this was compared to Wade Singleton's dive computer, which is the man who retrieved Tina off of the seafloor, he had covered twice the distance in half the time, as well as carrying Tina's body, which is a lot of physical exertion. And so that was kind of interesting that Wade was going farther and swam a shorter time than Gabe.
Yeah, Gabe seemed to kind of be taking a leisurely ascent instead of a panicked one. Dr. Stanley Stutz, who was one of the doctors that tried to help revive Tina, was also a diver, and while he was down, he witnessed what he described as a bear hug between Gabe and Tina. So he said that he saw Gabe and Tina facing each other. He saw Gabe with his arms around her back. And then he saw the two separate. He saw Tina start to sink and Gabe start to ascend. He thought it was kind of strange, but didn't really understand what was happening at that point. So he was told to stay with the dive group because they didn't really understand the severity of the situation.
Gabe never mentions bear hugging her. Rather, this is what he meant when he said, I tried to grab her, but she was too heavy. I don't know. But usually when someone is panicked, you don't bear hug them.
Especially a drowning person.
Yeah, even when you're up here on land, you don't bear hug someone panicking. You have to help them breathe, tell them to relax, calm them down. But instead, he bear hugged her under the water. So that was kind of interesting and a change of stories that Gabe had never mentioned.
Yeah, and like we said, we both have experience with diving, and I think you would say the same thing, that so much of your diving training is what to do in emergencies, how to work with faulty equipment, how to save yourself, how to help other people, how to be a good dive buddy, all that stuff.
Buddy breathing, ascending together. If someone's low on oxygen, you practice all of these things when you're training to get your open water, the basic certification. So him doing a rescue one, you would think he knew not to bear hug her in a panic state. Another really strange part of the story is Gabe's location when he left Tina. It didn't line up with her actual location. She should have been found beside of the wreck, but instead she was about 6 to 8 meters from the wreck, 90 degrees from the movement of the currents. So it wasn't like she would just drift over there. She was left over there, and it was in a very weird location which didn't line up with Gabe's location that he stated.
So things started looking kind of suspicious for Gabe, but you can kind of go two ways with all this information. Either he was just kind of really inept, really ignorant, didn't really know what was going on, and he was just trying to make himself look a little better. That's why his story was changing. Or you could say that he may have taken malicious action. So people were of kind of two minds. Colin McKenzie was an expert who had asserted that Watson should have been able to rescue Tina, but he later retracted this statement, and he claimed that Watson was just horribly inept and that he never should have been allowed on that dive. He never should have been able to be a dive buddy. He wasn't experienced, so he couldn't be a good dive buddy to someone even less experienced than he was.
Not to mention that Tina had lied on her application and stated that she hadn't had any heart problems or surgeries when she had a heart surgery a couple years prior to the dive.
A dive medicine expert, Professor Michael Bennett, said that Tina was not fit to dive, and other experts said that Watson was not fit to be a good dive buddy or to navigate that hard of a dive with so little experience.
Yeah, so the whole incident was doomed from the get-go. So it's kind of hard to tell at the moment rather this was just an accident or rather this was an actual purposeful murder.
And even we had a hard time kind of saying what we thought about it at this point, because with dive experience, we can say people do panic. People do lie about their qualifications. Some people might overhype how much experience they have and just think they're pretty hot stuff and think they can handle things that they can't handle. So it's hard to say.
And I think that's one thing about this case that makes it so interesting is both Brittany and I go back and forth on rather we think he did it or rather we think he didn't. And so far we've only discussed the dive, but now we're going to go on and talk to you about things that have kind of happened after the dive. And things just get a little bit crazier.
Tommy, Tina's father, was obviously really distraught. He was so far away from his daughter and she was gone and he couldn't do anything to be there with her. So he was really concerned about Tina's body being transported back to the US, and he was very adamant that he wanted Gabe to be with her the whole time on these flights, to not leave her alone. And Gabe said yes, he'd be on the flight. His mom had come and was helping him, so Gabe said that they would both be on this flight the whole way back to Alabama and Tina would not be alone. But as it happened, the plane had to make an emergency landing in New Zealand because of Gabe's ear pain. He said it was so severe they couldn't continue. They had to land the plane, which is a pretty big deal. They don't just land it for nothing.
No.
Gabe and his mother got off the plane at that point, and Tina's body went on to Alabama alone. Gabe and his mom caught a flight soon after, which, does that mean his ear problem was resolved, or we don't know.
Yeah, and it was so soon after the U.S. plane left that Tina's plane arrived Sunday morning, and Gabe's arrived Sunday night, so it was in the same day that those planes arrived. So he had to have gotten on a plane as quickly as possible.
And from there, things got even more suspicious.
Once they were back in America, they started to try to make some arrangements for the funeral. The Watson and Thomas family went back and forth on who was going to take charge of the arrangements, who was going to prepare the funeral. Gabe kind of took a lead and said, I want to have doves released at her funeral. And Tina's parents wanted to do this at their wedding, but Tina was really against it. She thought that animal cruelty was so awful, and even birds in a cage was animal cruelty, and she did not want that at her wedding. And so they brought up this concern to Gabe and told him, I don't think she would like the doves being released at her funeral. Gabe responded by stating that it wasn't about Tommy and Cindy, but it was about him.
Which, ugh, yikes.
That just automatically rubs anybody wrong.
Yeah.
He mentioned that Tina told him everything that she wanted done for her funeral on the plane on the way to Australia. Which
what 26-year-old on their honeymoon is talking about their funeral?
And not even just like, oh, I want people to be happy at my funeral. People to celebrate that I've moved on and I had an amazing life. No, who wants to sit here and talk about the nitty-gritty details of their funeral on their honeymoon with their husband? Tommy thought this was super weird because he said that he had never talked to Tina about this, that she wasn't one to just linger on that topic of funeral. She was very happy and positive, and she didn't really like to talk about this. So they thought it was very strange that she would have talked about this with Gabe on the plane to Australia. And the next part is so shocking that it was stated that Gabe mentioned to the family that they were lucky that he brought her body back, because he could have just had her cremated in Australia and spread her ashes, and that they should be thankful.
Which is such a gross thing to say to her parents,
It's sort of inhumane.
Yeah, like you're lucky I brought her back at all.
Yeah, it's so manipulative. And this, sadly, was just the beginning of a lot of controversy with Gabe. And Gabe had mentioned to Tommy at the time of discussing the funeral arrangements that they were blaming him for Tina's murder, which Tommy was astounded that this was brought up, because he didn't even think that Gabe had done anything at this point.
Yeah, they just thought it was a terrible accident. They had never mentioned blame to him at all. And Cindy, Tina's mother, had even gone over after they heard this and said, we don't blame you. Like, why would you think that we blame you? We don't.
So this was something like just out of Gabe's mind, I guess, that he had this impression that that was what they thought.
After a lot of back and forth, everyone finally agreed on a plot for Tina's body, but unfortunately, this wouldn't stay true for very long. We'll talk about that more later. While funeral arrangements were being made and these things were being talked about, Gabe and his father demanded that Tommy and Cindy give them Tina's Jeep, her belongings, all the wedding gifts, everything. They were very, very adamant about getting all this stuff immediately. And Tommy was in the midst of burying his daughter, and he said, can this wait? Can we just wait a few days? Can we bury her and get that out of the way and then deal with all of this? But they did not want to wait. They wanted that stuff immediately. They didn't care what it took. They just wanted it.
And I thought it was interesting that they said they wanted it for Gabe.
Yeah.
Like, Gabe was a priority at this point. Like, I think Tina was the priority, but
yeah,
they made it seem like Gabe had to have these items now.
And what's the difference? A few days, just like let them bury their daughter and grieve a little bit, and then you can sort it. You don't need wedding gifts right now. You don't need her Jeep right now. You can wait. Tommy ignored most of the requests, but he did deliver the Jeep. He put it in Gabe's driveway and decided that he would give him the keys at the funeral. But Gabe's parents were not happy with this and continued to harass them about the wedding gifts and her personal belongings.
David and Glenda, Gabe's parents, actually showed up to Tommy and Cindy's house to get the items. And Tommy had asked them to leave. They were like, we need some peace before we have to go to the viewing. And it got a little out of control. The police were actually threatened to be called, and that's finally when David and Glenda Watson left the Thomas's house.
And even worse than that, Gabe's family threatened to have Tina's family removed from the funeral if they made any comments he didn't like, if they did anything disruptive, quote unquote, or made any kind of statements that Gabe didn't like. He said that he would have them removed. He would call the police and have them removed from their own daughter's funeral.
And that just baffles me because I feel like if anybody should be removed, it's not the parents. The parents are the primary people who should be at that funeral for their daughter. I think it's just baffling that they would even recommend kicking them out.
Because remember, they had only been married 10 or 11 days. They hadn't been together that long. It's not like 50 years down the line, you know. She was still very involved with her parents. She still lived with them up until very, very shortly before her death. She was very involved with them, and they wanted to be a part of her funeral, her burial, and that whole process. And to be threatened to get forcibly removed, not just asked to leave, but the police to be called and all that is just awful.
It's like they're having their daughter's last bit of connection, and that closure is ripped away from them.
Yeah, exactly. So Ken Snyder, who we talked about earlier, is having some suspicions about Gabe. He just couldn't let it go in his mind. It kept, turning over in his head what happened, and he was like, something is just not right here. And he decided he really needed to get into contact with Tina's parents. So he called the funeral home. He left his name, his number, and said, can you please pass this along to Tommy and have him get in touch with me? And Tommy did. He called him back, and eventually they set up a meeting to meet face to face and talk about things.
After this, Tommy and Cindy decided to fly out to Australia with Alonda, which was Tina's sister, and meet the person that pulled Tina's body from the water, Wade Singleton. Now, Alonda was pregnant at the time, and when they got there, Alonda and Cindy decided to stay on land while Tommy went out with Wade on the boat on the Jazz 2 to see the wreck site where Tina had this incident. While they were there, they started asking Singleton some questions that were on their mind, and they asked if Gabe was on the boat helping resuscitate Tina, as he said he had, but Singleton said no, that he wasn't on the boat.
Yeah, and I don't know if we mentioned, but when Tina's mom first talked to Gabe, one of the things she asked was, were you with her? Were you calling out her name? Were you trying to help her? And he had said, yes, I was there with her. I was right by her side, but that was a lie.
Yeah, so Singleton told them, no, he was not with Tina when we were trying to resuscitate her, and he only went over to her when he found out that she was officially declared dead.
So even though a lot of this strife was centered around the family, friends were also kind of seeing some weird things in Gabe. Amanda Phillips, who we mentioned as Tina's best friend, she tried to stay in contact with Gabe, even though they had kind of a rocky relationship in the past, but she wanted to stay close to him because she wanted to stay close to Tina's memory, and she wanted to make sure he was okay and everything. So she kept in contact with him, and when she was in Birmingham, they would meet up and things like that. One of these times that Amanda was in Birmingham with her husband, they went to attend a football game, and Gabe came along, and they all had a tailgate. This was less than a month after Tina had died, and Amanda said you would never have known that there was anything wrong with Gabe, that anything had happened, that he was happy, he was laughing, having a great time, which, people handle grief different ways, but that still rubbed her the wrong way. And she was like, there was this weird tension in the air because they weren't talking about Tina. No one mentioned her at all. And, he was just living it up.
They were probably drinking, having good food, and it probably seemed a little weird for her.
To make matters weirder, around Christmas time, Amanda received a card from Gabe, and this card was a picture of Gabe and Tina on their wedding day. And on the back of the picture was a handwritten note, and it said, quote, "This pic will have to hold you over until I can get down there with the book. Who is that sexy guy in the picture with Tina? Oh yeah, that's me, smiley face. Have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. Love, Gabe." And that really sent her over the edge of, this is not right. Like, that is not the way you handle this.
Well, it sounds like he was kind of being boastful, kind of cocky about himself, and
yeah, and to send that with a picture of his dead wife is just,
to his wife's best friend since ninth grade. It's kind of
such bad taste,
slimy,
really gross. Yeah, so gross. Not even mentioning thanks for being a friend in this hard time or something like that, but ugh.
Yeah, he could have said, it's been hard without Tina, but thank you for reaching out. You've been a great friend. I hope you have a Merry Christmas.
Yeah.
But instead he's like, who's that sexy guy with Tina? Oh, that's me. Smiley face.
Yeah.
Even if you're trying to lighten the mood, there's better ways to go about it than that.
Yeah, that is
things go even farther, and this is when stuff kind of looks like motives could come into play. Gabe told her father that he had the right to all of her belongings, even though they had only been married for 11 days. And he told her father that he needed to go get all of her things together to give to him. Also, Gabe asked Tina to up the life insurance right before the wedding and to make him the sole beneficiary. She told her father about this, and she said she didn't have time to do it. With planning the wedding and all the stuff going on, it was just too much to try to make him the sole beneficiary right now. And her father said, you know what, tell Gabe that you handled it, and I will help you whenever you get back from your honeymoon.
Because her father was actually in the insurance industry, so he knew how all that stuff worked. He knew, what the best time to do it was. So he just said, tell him it's fine. We'll take care of it later.
And so when they went on their honeymoon, Gabe believed that he was the sole beneficiary to Tina's life insurance. And when he had gotten back from the trip, this is after Tina had passed away, it was found out that he had gone to her work immediately and asked about her insurance after getting back from Australia. And they told him that he wasn't entitled to it. And this supposedly made him very mad. He got very visibly unhappy. The coroner believes that this was a possible reason for murder because it wasn't just the father's hearsay, but the company actually backed up what the father said by saying, yeah, he did come by and ask about her life insurance policy.
So all of Gabe's behavior since the incident in Australia was really gross and really creepy, really weird, and it rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. But what they were finding now is that this behavior didn't start when he got back from Australia, that he had been doing this for a long time. Before they even got engaged, Tina had a Mazda Miata. It was her dream car. She had wanted it since she was a little kid. It was a little convertible and she loved it. But Gabe didn't like this car. He didn't want her to have it. So he made her trade in this Miata for a Jeep Cherokee.
This is kind of weird, and it strikes me weird because he didn't like the Mazda Miata and he wanted her to get a Jeep Cherokee. And then right after she died, if you remember, he was like, I need that Jeep Cherokee.
Yeah. So not only is it really weird for you to be like, I don't like your car, you needed to get a different one, but also to get one that you want and then to immediately demand it back in such a short time after your wife dies is it's
seems
just
kind
weird.
of fishy.
Yeah. And that wasn't the only incident of controlling behavior. One time they were at a pizza shop and she did something he didn't like, and allegedly he picked up a pizza and threw it at her.
That's like really aggressive.
Yeah. And in public, just before they got married, they also had kind of ups and downs in their relationship. But for a long time before they even got engaged, Gabe had a ring and he kept it out in the open, basically on top of his TV, and he kept threatening Tina that if she looked at it, he was never going to propose. And so he kept kind of dangling it in front of her face and figuratively, toying with her with the engagement, knowing that's what she wanted. She really wanted to be engaged. She wanted to marry him. And for a long time, he held that over her.
And Tina even mentioned it was either Amanda or Tommy, that sometimes she felt like he was teasing her with this ring just to get her to do what he wanted.
But she put up with it because, like I said, she really wanted to be engaged. She wanted him to propose.
Tina was becoming slightly unhappy. She was having to deal with this engagement ring just sitting in front of her, and she was dealing with a very controlling and manipulative situation. And her friends were noticing that she was becoming unhappy. So go for it.
At one point, Gabe and Tina even took a break from their relationship, but soon they got back together.
Yeah, and so in March 2003, she went to visit her friend, which was Amanda's cousin, Alexander Lorenz, in Atlanta for the weekend. And they had been sending a few flirtatious emails back and forth, and I think they had something in the past, and then it was kind of sparking up a little bit. And she decided to go and test it out for the weekend, but there weren't any sparks with them, and she decided that wasn't going to work. She didn't talk to Gabe all weekend. She ignored his calls, wouldn't text him back, and then finally she told him about where she was, and he was angry. which I can understand. Basically, she was with Gabe and she was going to visit another guy that she was sending flirtatious emails with. Not a very great situation. So I can understand why Gabe would probably get a little angry. But then he proposed to her the next month near Easter.
So her friends thought they worked through everything, things were going to go better, but they still had some issues between them. So Tina's sister, Alonda, was pregnant by September of 2003, and Tina had decided that because Alonda and her husband had recently split up, that she was going to help her sister when the baby came. She was going to be there and take care of this baby. And Gabe really didn't like that. He did not want Tina to be taking care of the baby, and he was upset she was going to be doing that.
And that just kind of wraps up all of his controlling behaviors and how before the marriage, during the engagement, and during the 10 days they were married, most likely, there was this very manipulative personality that he was giving off. So we mentioned earlier that the family had agreed on a plot to put Tina's body, and it doesn't really hold up. Gabe started trying to get her body exhumed after she had been buried and get it moved, but things kept falling through. They weren't progressing. Issues kept coming up, and he kept changing the dates, and the exhumation never really happened. But on October 7th, 2005, they finally exhumed Tina's body and moved it to a plot that was 100 yards away, owned by Gabe. The interesting part is Gabe didn't even attend the exhumation. It was only Gabe's dad and his attorney and Tina's father, Tommy, with one of his friends. And this was really traumatic for Tommy. He did not want his daughter to be moved. He didn't want to disturb her burial. And the fact that she was only moving 100 yards away seems a little ridiculous, kind of like a petty joke
like
in a way.
Pointed attack at her family, to say, I have control and you don't, and there's nothing you can do about it. And there wasn't. They just had to watch this happen, and he had to see his daughter moved. But still, he would visit this grave many times. He went just about every 2 weeks. He would travel a lot for work, so every time he was in town, he would go visit and put flowers and gifts and things like that on her grave. But what he was noticing was every time he would put flowers down, they'd be gone within a couple days. That someone was removing these flowers and little gifts or vandalizing things, and it was really upsetting to him. Tommy ended up actually chaining flowers to the grave. He used a bike chain and chained these up, and they still disappeared. The chain was cut and the flowers were gone. So on the advice of the police, he made an official police report each time this happened that he would add to. And after a while, the police were like, yeah, what is happening? Like, why is this going on? So a police officer actually had a stakeout. He sat there and they put fresh flowers down. They even chained them up. And what this officer saw was, who else but Gabe Watson coming down the line with bolt cutters. And he watched him cut the chain, throw it in the trash, take the flowers and destroy them and walk off.
It was said by Gabe that the reason he did this was because he didn't want the gaudy arrangements, but it seems like there could be something deeper too. Was he trying to get revenge on the family? Was he mad at Tina for all of the legal issues that were going to arise? What was going on in his head? We have no idea.
Yeah, it's such a malicious thing to do, and it takes so much effort to go out there. It's not just ignoring them or like, I don't want to talk to you, or I want her stuff back. Like, to take that effort, to take bolt cutters, to go out to her grave every time flowers went down and destroy them. That's such a malicious thing to do to a grieving family.
Yeah, not to mention that her grave was unmarked. So people were going and putting flowers and acknowledging that she was there, and he was just taking them away.
Yeah, she didn't have a marker until Gabe put a foot marker down in 2009. And her father really wanted to get a marker, but he had no way to do it. He had no legal right over the plot that Tina was in. So it was a really upsetting time for them.
And this just kind of goes back to, seems like he loves control. He loves to control the situation and to control people around him. So looking at all of the stuff that they've found out, from his inconsistent stories to his manipulative and controlling behavior and to his rocky relationships with Tina's family, the police kind of came up with a theory. Maybe the day of the incident, Gabe said his dive computer wasn't working, so they returned out of the water, which allowed time for the other divers to be gone further away, so that way they would have a little bit of privacy, and then this would have fewer witnesses to the incident. Gabe then took her farther from other divers, and he bear hugged her, turned off her air. She started to panic and she tried to fight, which damaged some of his diving gear, dislodging his mask and his regulator, as he said. And then she was unconscious and began to fall, which they then believe that Gabe swam down, turned back on her air before he decided to ascend and get help. And after reenacting the situation with people that were similarly sized as Tina and Gabe, they determined that it was possible for this bear hug and turning off the air to happen with Gabe's size compared to Tina. The only issue is they were lacking the motive. They couldn't come up with a secure motive to why this may have happened.
And if you'll remember, we talked about the insurance and him trying to collect and not being the beneficiary. So the coroner would kind of mention that as a possible motive later, but they didn't have a solid motive yet. In March of 2005, Gabe sued the travel insurance company for $45,000. He was claiming money for the accidental death, compensation for the trip, and, bills, medical bills, all those kinds of things, and also mental anguish of having to watch his wife die. But the insurance company refused to pay out, and it was dismissed in 2008 because Gabe's own legal team decided that if they continued with this lawsuit, that Gabe might incriminate himself somehow or say something that could be used against him. So they decided just to drop the whole thing, that it wasn't worth it, and it was dropped in 2008.
However, Mike Ball Expeditions, which is the group that Tina and Gabe went out with for the dive, were sued and pled guilty to not following their own safety standards, and they had to pay $6,500 plus another $1,500 for investigative and professional costs. And in 2008, Gabe Watson actually remarried to a woman named Kim Lewis, and a lot of people say that they look extremely similar, but we all have types. We all have.
On April 4th, 2008, the coroner's inquest stated, quote, "On the 22nd day of October 2003, at the site of the historical shipwreck Yongala, 48 nautical miles southeast of the port of Townsville in the state of Queensland, David Gabriel Watson murdered Christina May Watson." Watson wasn't present for this inquest. He had actually refused to come back to Australia. He was in America, and he had said something like, "You couldn't pull me back to Australia," kicking and screaming. So he was just represented by his lawyers during this time.
On June 20th, 2008, the coroner laid the charge that Gabe had murdered Tina. And the Crown prosecutor, Brennan Campbell, had noticed that Gabe was giving 16 different versions of his story, and none of them matched up with eyewitnesses from that day. So in 2009, Gabe had been resisting extradition for 6 months, but he voluntarily decided to go to Australia for a trial. This part gets kind of fishy. Maybe Gabe had gotten a deal for being charged with manslaughter in Australia rather than being charged with murder here, and that's why he went, because he knew that the outcome would have been less severe.
So because he was being tried for manslaughter instead of murder, not all of the evidence was presented. Anything beyond what could have him convicted of manslaughter was just omitted during this trial. So no jury actually got to see all of the evidence that they had. And some people in Tina's family thought this was not a fair trial, that Tina was not getting justice with this.
After Gabe pled guilty to manslaughter, he got sentenced to 4.5 years, but he was only going to serve 12 months of that sentence. The Alabama Attorney General Troy King and the Queensland Attorney General Cameron Dick put in an appeal with the Queensland Supreme Court. They wanted to add an additional 2.5 years to Gabe's sentence, and this was heard in July 2009. So in September 2009, the court ended up increasing his sentence, but they only did it by 6 months. So he had a total of 18 months in an Australian prison for the manslaughter of Tina Watson. And the charge for manslaughter was by failure to render aid to a dive buddy. And Tina's parents did not support this charge. They thought that he needed to be charged with murder, that this was just a slap on the wrist, and that it wasn't good enough.
In May of 2010, Troy King indicated that he had enough to try Watson for capital murder. So what they wanted to do was extradite Watson back to the U.S. so he could be tried for murder after he served his sentence for manslaughter in Australia. During this time, Troy King asked the Australian investigators for all the evidence they had. He wanted to go over everything and have it all in one place. They said they would not provide it unless the death penalty was taken off the table. In Australia, the death penalty is seen as a violation of human rights, and they said they couldn't in good conscience send someone back if they were going to have their human rights violated. They said, you take that off the table, and then we'll send you the evidence, and eventually he did. So in June of 2010, Troy King tells them we're not going to push for the death penalty, and he gets all the evidence. And in November of 2010, when Watson was done with his sentence in Australia, he was immediately deported back to the U.S. to stand trial. As soon as he touched down in the U.S., he was arrested, he was held in jail for a couple days, and then he was released on bond. So one condition of this bond was that Gabe had to stay away from the grave. He couldn't disturb it, he couldn't visit it, he couldn't do anything with it. He had to stay away. At this time, Tommy was also made the administrator of Tina's estate, and Gabe was removed as administrator, so Tommy finally had control over his daughter's estate and what would happen to her stuff. And so after he became administrator, he asked Gabe for an inventory of her things, and really he said he just wanted photos and yearbooks and little mementos and things like that. He didn't want everything. He just wanted the stuff that meant a lot to him, and Gabe refused to provide an inventory. He never turned over any photos, nothing.
Which once again goes back to his controlling behavior. He just wanted to know that he had a leg up on everybody else.
Gabe's legal team tried to get this charge of murder pushed off. They said it was double jeopardy, that he was being charged twice for the same crime, and that it was a violation of his rights. But legally speaking, because it was in two different countries, two different governments, double jeopardy does not apply in that situation. So he definitely could be tried. And there was also an issue where the crime happened in Australia, so it wasn't their jurisdiction. But Troy King stated that the reason they could try him for murder in Alabama was that they were asserting that it was premeditated and the planning had taken place in Alabama. So part of the crime had taken place there and they had jurisdiction. So the charge was laid and the trial was set for the 13th of February, 2012. But it never would go in front of a jury. A lot of the evidence was deemed inadmissible. Anything about the life insurance was inadmissible. A lot of things about Watson's behavior after the events was inadmissible. So a lot of the evidence that they had collected couldn't even be shared. And on February 23rd, 2012, the murder charge was dismissed by a Birmingham judge, Tommy Nail. He said there wasn't enough evidence to continue the trial, and he just dismissed it outright without ever putting it in front of a jury. And that was the end of that.
He never got convicted with murder in Alabama, and he only served 18 months in Australia for manslaughter. And now that we've laid out all of this information on the table for you to look at, you can kind of see why we go back and forth. Did he murder her, or was it just an accident? Was it just them not having the proper background to go dive and panicking in a situation that they weren't skilled to be in?
Yeah, I really keep going back and forth. When you just look at the incident itself, I can really see how you would say it's just a horrible accident. He was inept. He thought he was a lot more skilled than he actually was, and he panicked when things went wrong and didn't act like he should have acted. And it's hard to say how someone's going to act in a trauma. You know, some people fight, flight, freeze, that whole thing. You don't know what you're going to be doing. So even though he should have been trained, he should have known what he was doing.
Seems like an accident.
Yeah, but then you look at his behavior afterwards and how malicious he was and how he had really attacked Tina's parents over and over again, knowing what would hurt them the most, and just continually for years beating them down with that stuff. And you think, okay, what kind of person is he?
Yeah, and you, even looking at the ways he behaved before and after, you think, okay, some of it was a little suspicious, and I guess that could mean something malicious may have happened, and he might be getting what he wanted with the life insurance. He was trying to get the life insurance and stuff like that. But at the same time, he could also just be a douchebag.
Yeah, he could definitely just be an asshole that just...
He could be arrogant because, as Brittany, you mentioned while we were doing research, the parents kind of seem to do the same kind of things Gabe does. They're very controlling and pushy and manipulative, it seems.
Yeah, you would think that his parents would be kind of a voice of reason, like, don't demand her stuff back immediately, just give him a couple days. And because Tina's parents weren't even refusing to give them the stuff, they just wanted time to bury their daughter and grieve. And Gabe decided that he just needed that stuff immediately, and his parents really backed him up on everything. And, you know, even the times he was just being awful.
Also, in Tommy's testimony, we didn't really mention this, but it seemed the way that he described the encounters that David and Glenda, Gabe's parents, were the ones really pushing, and that he would go up to Gabe and be like, can't you just wait, please? And that Gabe wouldn't even want to talk to him. He would just ignore him or walk away. Like, Gabe wasn't the one confronting with the situation as much. It was more so his parents taking this charge to be like, no, he needs this. So it kind of gives a weird perspective. Like, did he do it, or is he just a jerk?
Yeah. Because personally, I think at the very least, he deserved the manslaughter charge. Just looking at the facts of the case, he definitely didn't do his duty as a dive buddy.
Absolutely.
He didn't save her or even attempt to save her, even though he really could have.
He was qualified. He could have saved her.
Absolutely.
He had a rescue certification.
So I think at the very least, like, yes, he did commit manslaughter and he deserved that time he got. But then later, I don't know. I still don't know about the murder.
And we have to consider that police don't always release all of the information. So there could be things that we don't even know that they know. And maybe that's why they haven't convicted him of murder.
Right. So our information could be somewhat limited there and could not be seeing the full picture. But it's just so hard to say, because being an asshole doesn't mean you're necessarily a murderer. But it does lend some evidence of your character, and I think it would take someone of a certain character to commit a crime like that, and you just have to wonder.
Yeah, a very interesting case, and we definitely enjoyed researching all of it and seeing all of the nooks and crannies.
Yeah, there was a lot of twists and turns with this one, so we hope that you could keep up with all of it. And if you want to see images and the diagrams that we talked about, definitely go to our website and check it out. You can see our show notes, and if you want to learn more about this case, there's some more information there too.
And on one of the links that we'll have up, they actually have scans of Gabe's dive logs as well, so you can go and check out what his dives were like, where he went, how long he was down, all the little details about the depth and whatnot. So,
and there's all the witness statements, and you could definitely get lost in the abyss with this case.
Yeah. Thank you guys so much for tuning in and listening to this episode about Christina Watson. We really appreciate it, and we love your support. Go ahead and like us, subscribe, follow us, write us. Let us know if you have any recommendations for a case. We love to hear your opinions, your ideas, things you know about. Or if we missed something on our case, let us know. We love to hear about these cases, and we want to know if there's something we didn't know.
Yeah, if you have any thoughts or opinions about this case or any of the cases we talk about, definitely contact us. We have a Facebook group for discussion on these cases as well, so lots of ways for you to get in touch and keep the conversation going.
So make sure you tune in on our next episode. It's going to be a good one, and if you want to keep listening, we'll have some of our mess ups and goofs from this episode. Thanks for listening.
See you next time. That ended so funny.
Pizzazz fingers of the SS
Sorry, joked
on air because they had a mouth Townsville.
No movement that you can see in the picture, but Paula just. But it's. Wow.
I'm struggling.
Because the
Damn.
called Gabe Snape. Snape killed Dumbledore.
Dumbledore.
The Force.
Force?
Did you just smell yourself?
Oh. Indigestion. Just a little ingestion. Indigestion.
Ingestion. A little ingestion.
Indigestion.